Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm really happy to be with you here today. My name is Annie Gibson, and I'm the director of the Office of Study Abroad at Tulane. And so happy to join Professor Sims and her students, as well as my good friend Mattia Della Rocca. Today is a special day because we are doing a Global Perspectives, and Global Perspectives is a series at Tulane put on by the Center for Global Education to try to enhance on-campus classrooms with global experiences. So we work with faculty members that are addressing really important topics of our time in a global context, and bring in invited guests from our partner institutions to talk about what these themes or what these events are like in other countries worldwide. So we work with faculty. We also work with student groups on this. So if you're in a student group and you would like to be connected with other student leaders around a particular theme, you can get in touch with the Center for Global Education at osa@tulane.edu, and we can help you meet other students, meet a faculty member, meet an NGO that is doing work that you're interested in, and we'll help you coordinate that, help with the budget for that. So let us know. So I have the pleasure of introducing Mattia Della Rocca, and he and Professor Sims and I became close during Tulane's summer program in Italy. So I want to give a quick shout out that if any of you are interested in going to Italy this summer with Professor Sims, there is a program this summer, and I'm going to put in the chat the link to the Summer in Italy program, so you can be with us in person in Italy on our programs. We also have many semester study abroad options in Italy for many different majors, and I'll just put those in the chat too. If you're interested in studying abroad in Italy, please come see us at the Center for Global Education. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Professor Mattia Della Rocca. He has a PhD in philosophy and history of science. And among his main topics of interest is the relationship between science and society in contemporary times. And he has a particular interest in the historical epistemological investigation of neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science. And in recent years, his research focuses on the concept of natural and digital environment and their interactions with the human mind. He's an adjunct faculty member in psychology at the University of Rome Tor Vergata, and also teaches in the Graduate School of Psychotherapy, and teaches at the CIEE Rome Study Abroad Institute, which is where the summer program is housed. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Professor Della Rocca.
Thank you, Professor Gibson, for this introduction. Thank you, Professor Sims, and thank you, everybody, for being here in this morning. It's afternoon right here in Italy, but since I know that this is a morning lesson for you, a morning lecture, I really want to thank you for your attention in advance, because I am really excited to participate in this Global Perspectives lecture, since I spent a lot of time with Professor Gibson and Professor Sims while they were here in Italy this summer, talking about the role of international and intercultural dialogue for defining the new perspectives of our discipline, psychology. And I am really excited to deliver this lecture to you today. And I just want to skip to the introduction. So if I am allowed, Emma, I will share my presentation with the class right now. Okay. I hope that we will have the time for some questions later, and feel free to also to write them in the chat or report them to Professor Sims at the end of our lecture. So, what are we going to talk about today in this lecture? The title is Psychopathology and Cultural Experience. Is a very broad title for this presentation. But I have found some questions that can lead us in exploring this very, very complex issue, that is the conceptualization and interpretation of psychopathology and mental illness in different cultural contexts. Of course, I'm going to focus about the interpretation that is provided within the Italian culture, that can be seen as a special case of the European approach to psychopathology. Of course, I will be glad at the end of this lecture also to confront what I'm gonna say about this issue with your own opinion and with your, for example, also your personal research or your academic research made with the group of Professor Sims. So let's move to an overview of this lecture. I think that these questions can, in a way, give us the outline of what we are gonna discuss today. The first question is, what are the different interpretations of mental disorders in the United States and the European Union, and more specifically in Italy? Second question is about the reasons behind the European and Italian peculiar perspective on mental disorders, and a related question, what are the consequences of adopting a very specific view of mental illness and mental health in our culture? Finally, I am wondering, quite rhetorically, what can history tell us about the developments of this approach and about the future, and above all, the future challenges for psychopathology, both in Italy and Europe and in the United States. I want to say in the beginning that I share with Professor Sims the belief that Europe and the United States have still a lot to say to global culture, and I think that deep refashioning, redefinition of the tenets of our discipline can actually help us to face new challenges, a new form of mental illness that are slightly appearing and become widespread all around the world, and especially in the Western world. So, of course, I don't want to introduce you to data that you are quite used because of the great classes that Professor Sims are delivering to you, but I'm moving directly to the state of the art about mental health in the European Union and in Italy. Let's take a look at some facts and figures about it. And let's see what the report titled Health at Glance, published in 2019 by the European Commission, has revealed to the European Union and its citizens. Mental health is problematic for about 84 million people across all the Union. It's around 9% of the overall population, and it has become probably the most prominent and important point in the definition of health policies here in Europe, because the total costs related to mental health in the European Union is about the 4% of the gross domestic products of all the Union. It's about 600 billion of euros. And this was the situation in 2015. Of course, however, and this is something that is very good to introduce ourselves to the issue, to the actual topic of this lecture. Even if this is a general estimation, The fact is that not every country denounces the same amount of mental health issues in their domestic population. It's quite easy to see that countries from the north of Europe, like Finland or Netherlands or France, Ireland, are very good in reporting, that means in intercepting mental health issues in their population. Italy is on the right side of the graph, but however, it's still about 70% of cases that have been reported and denounced in the national health system. But you can see that some other countries, especially countries that are in the so-called Eastern bloc of Europe, have a lower percentage of people with mental health. This is a clue that things are better in the East of Europe. No, not at all. This is something that has to do with the cultural interpretation and the associated stigma that is present and that are present in those countries. For example, the first thing that we have to put it on the table and start to analyze is the fact that in some countries there is a lesser awareness of what a mental illness is, and there are backlashes, severe backlashes related to the concept of psychiatric stigma. For example, in almost every country in the East of Europe, especially Poland or Hungary, it is better not to talk about mental illness because there is a very strong stigma associated to mental disorders. Furthermore, this is something that I want to add because I think that it's very important. There is also still lingering in the cultural environment of those countries an association between some specific behavior, some specific and completely normal behavior, like for example sexual orientation, that are associated sometimes in a complete arbitrary way to mental illness. This is, of course, a political problem, but as you can easily see, this affects also the health policies of these countries. This means that it's very difficult for a person having a mental health issue to go to the hospital or to a psychiatrist saying, I feel depressed, or I have anxiety, or I have other form of mental health issue or disorders, because these can be a very stigmatizing factor in carrying on an ordinary life, a normal life. If we move our focus toward Italy, we can see that the 16.9% of Italian population had a mental health issue at some point in his or her life. I think that this is very important. This is an important number because it's something that is related to, especially to new forms of depression that we're gonna discuss later during this lecture. Just imagine that exclusively in 2019, more than 800,000 individuals have denounced to suffer from mental disorders and required the intervention from our national health system. Even the demographic of these patients, of this cohort of patients, are quite significant. The 54% of the patients were female, and also the age reflected the aging of the general population. Probably you know that Italy is a very old country in respect to other countries in the European Union, and these numbers are reflecting in a way the aging of the population. What are the pathologies, the mental disorders that are reported the most by Italian people? At the national level, we have depression at first place. Depression is probably the most widespread mental health issue in the country, immediately followed by schizophrenia. And at the third place, we can find the neurotic and somatoform syndromes. And this is something that I would like to talk a little bit more later, because there is a very strong association with specific cultural forms of Italy and the so-called somatoform syndromes that I am it's awkward to say this, but it's sometimes called by the lay population still nowadays hysteria. Okay, this is very, very important to remember, and we're gonna face this not exclusively on a psychopathological level or a cultural level, but also a societal one. So, provided with these introduction and facts and figures, let's take a first comparison. Let's make a first comparison. If we look for comparison between data, we can see that there is not a so deep and clear difference between what is happening in the United States and in the European Union. But however, when I hope that you will come here in Italy and you will have the opportunity to see with your own eyes, mental health in Italy is approached and discussed in a very different way in respect to the United States. Just think that in 2018, we had an important celebration that year, because it was the 40th anniversary of a law that made a revolution within the community of both psychologists and psychiatrists, but we're gonna discuss this revolution of 1978 later. During the celebration for the 40 years of this psychiatric revolution that occurred in Italy, the Ministry of Health decided to promote a campaign for mental health by using this phrase: da vicino nessuno è normale. Translated, it means, if seen close enough, nobody is normal. And Professor Sims read these quotes on the wall of a museum that I'm gonna present to you later in this lecture, and that I hope that I can guide you through the corridors of the museum. But what does this phrase mean? What does this quote mean? It reflects perfectly the way by which we interpret and conceptualize mental illness in Italy in 21st century. And this is the result of a series of dialectical and historical events that led eventually to a very specific approach that, for example, banishes the word normal and abnormal from our psychological vocabulary. We discussed this with Professor Sims during the summer, and of course I am completely aware of the fact that there is nothing wrong in using the word abnormal psychology in the context of US psychology and US education about psychology, because it's, technically speaking, something that goes out of the norm. But I told to Professor Sims that we have a sort of innate fear in using this term because of our history. I'm gonna highlight this history in detail right now, but if you think about the use of the word normal and abnormal by dictatorships here in Europe, You can easily guess why we tend to avoid the use of this term, preferring the word psychopathology. But let's take a look closer to this history, because I am a philosopher and historian of science, and even if I teach psychology almost everywhere in the institutions where I work, but I really think that history of science, history of medicine and psychology can help us to see the greater picture and to understand what, not just what is going on, but why some things are going on this way. So what was the situation of, what was the history of mental health in the Italian context? During the first half of the 20th century, Italian psychiatry and psychopathology were completely dominated by the so-called organicistic perspective. And nowadays, it's called the biomedical perspective, the biomedical approach to mental illness. This meant that a mental illness, a mental disorder was considered essentially as a neurological disorder. Everything was about the brain and the chemical of the chemical functioning of the brain, even if nobody at the time had a clue about the actual functioning of brain chemistry. Okay, there was just one exception, but it has its own history and it's very complex. I'm talking about psychoanalysis, because Sigmund Freud, in the first part of the 20th century, had exerted a very deep impact on the way by which, through which Europeans thought about the mind and mental health issues. However, it is important to understand that the Catholic Church here in Italy technically forbidden the teaching of psychoanalysis, and since there was this strong association between Jewish people and psychoanalysis, the racist laws passed by Mussolini and fascism during the first half of the century made psychoanalysis something that had to be avoided in the public discourse. These changed suddenly at the end of World War II, and the psychoanalytic view became hegemonic together with the organicistic perspective. There was like a sort of balance between these two approaches, but it was not actually a balance aimed to the integration of different models in one single consistent theory or theoretical framework, but it was most a sort of separation. For example, Rome and Trieste were cities where psychoanalysis was growing at a very high rate, and psychoanalysis became easily popular in those years in those cities. But for example, the city of Milan, Pisa, and Naples remained households of this kind of the organicistic approach. And the organicistic approach in the first half of the 20th century here in Italy had some strings attached, some horrible strings attached. What I'm talking about. Mental illness was associated with the poorest part of the population, especially from the south of Italy, especially women, and especially people that were not able to read or write. And a very common practice was the forced hospitalization. And this way to understand and interpret psychiatry was, in the end, for a tool for a systematic oppression of what the government and the intelligentsia called the abnormals. And it's very, very easy to see who these abnormals were. the so-called, I apologize for using this term, they are just historical terms, the mad women, the dark-skinned people from the South. There was a lot of racism against people from the South. It's something that we overcome just in the 70s, also because the revolution in psychiatry. But for example, a lot of people migrating from the South to the North was forced to hospitalization because there were problems about actually speaking, it was all about the integration with capitalist societies in the North, capitalist context in the North, but this inability to melt in the context, to meet the demands of the cultural and societal context was interpreted as a form of mental illness. And as you can see in this picture, this is a picture from a documentary from the Istituto Luce, the National Institute of Cinematography, depicting the way patients were treated. This was the so-called forced shower. This was not a form of hygienic practice. This was a form of treatment. Patients were obliged to stay under this very, very cold shower for hours in order to repress every form of convulsion or expression of the self. Okay, and unfortunately, I'm not making a good reputation to Italy. I'm not doing a very good job to my country, but it's history, and we have to be honest and follow historical truth. Italy has a record, and is one of the worst records you can imagine, because it's the invention of electroshock therapy. This man was Ugo Cerletti. He served as one of the most important psychiatrists of the first half of the 20th century. And the technology, the machine that you can see in the right picture is the original electroshock machine created by Cerletti in 1938. Is stored and is exposed at the Museum of the History of Medicine at the Sapienza University of Rome. There is a very, very important museum that keeps a lot of machines and technologies, but also books about the history of medicine and psychiatry. And I don't have to talk about but like I don't have to say what electroshock is, but even if nowadays this technique is still employed as a treatment, also here in Italy, it is a completely different thing from the past. Today, physicians and psychiatrists will use electrocution in order to stimulate the brain, do this avoiding any form of physical harm or physical pain, and above all, following up patients in order to take a look at their conditions. And usually one cycle of electroshock therapy nowadays in Italy is like, a session in 6 months, okay? And it's completely another thing in respect to what Cerletti did. Cerletti had this idea that insulin therapy with insulin, provoking insulin shock and insulin coma, was too cruel. And since insulin therapy was cruel, he decided to invent something that, in his opinion, was nicer in respect to the patients. And I don't know actually how somebody can think that making somebody losing all their teeth because of the convulsion can be something nice, but this was the hegemonic and most prominent approach to psychiatry. Cerletti was awarded for this invention, okay? And When Cerletti was at the climax of his career, the situation in Italy was completely made up of asylums filled of people with no distinction about the actual illness, the form of the disorder that people had. There was a very deep separation between theory and practice. Psychologists, psychiatrists could study for years the labels of mental disorders. There was a lot of debate about we have to call this form of illness dementia or dementia precox, or other terms drawn from German, from also the English and the American traditions. It was also the historical period when the first antidepressant drugs were introduced, both in the United States and Europe. But then eventually, if you had the possibility to visit an asylum, both a criminal and a non-criminal asylum, what you were about to see was cages fulfilled of people with no respect for their dignity or their autonomy, or not even, it wasn't even considered that a treatment or something that could boost the dignity and the freedom of the patients were contemplated. Okay, nobody thought about this. They just wanted to hide and to separate from society people suffering from mental illness. And I'm talking about around the end of the 40s. Okay. Then, in front of this situation, something changed because the 60s came. And as you know, 60s were years when all the Western civilization suddenly tried to change and to revolutionize the way the Western societies thought of themselves and organized the life of people in Western countries. So in Italy, something very important happened, starting from exactly a reflection upon the relationship between mental illness and culture. And this happened mostly and firstly with the work of this man, Ernesto De Martino. Ernesto De Martino wasn't a psychologist and not even neither a psychiatrist, but he was an anthropologist. But he worked all through his life on the relationship between mental illness and culture, and he concentrated his efforts especially on some somatoform disturbs connected to a cultural event. I'm talking about tarantismo. Have you ever heard about this word, tarantismo? Tarantismo is what you can look at in the picture, is a cultural phenomenon that is typical from the south of Italy and reminds a lot of the ancient rituals in the ancient Greek culture of the Bacchantes, the rituals about Dionysus and Bacchus and wine and freedom and the female part of society. And it is also a cultural phenomenon that inspired the public imagination about what during the 19th century was called hysteria. What is tarantism? It's the belief that somebody, usually a sort of psychological scapegoat within a group or within a society, is bitten by a tarantula. And since the bite of the tarantula is toxic, this individual, usually a woman, but not in every case, started to have convulsions and started to speak freely about patriarchal oppression, about poor conditions of life. And this was something that was accepted by society. People suffering from tarantismo, from the bite of a tarantula. Of course, there aren't tarantula in Italy. This is very important to know. There aren't tarantula, and there aren't toxic tarantula. So you can be sure that it was not something related to the poison of a spider. Okay, it was just a psychological issue. During tarantismo phenomena, people were allowed to speak freely, even against the society's rule, for example. Okay, and this wasn't considered a form of mental illness until the rise of the organicistic approach by Cerletti and other psychiatrists and psychologists like him. They said it's not a cultural event. If somebody, especially a woman, is having convulsions and she yells or she starts a fight, this is hysteria. This is a mental illness. So we have to hospitalize her and to remove her from society. Ernesto De Martino hold a completely different view of this fact. He said, if society has found a way to interpret mental, what can be considered in Western terms, a mental disease, as a form of collective catharsis, it's not something that we can, it's not a perspective that we can adopt also on a scientific level. So he had a brilliant idea and he started to study the psychopathologies of people migrated from Italy to Germany looking for work. And he noticed that all the people going to Germany, so looking for fortune and money and a better life, a lot of them had crises that were interpreted by German psychopathologists and psychotherapists as a form of mental illness. But Ernesto De Martino said, no, it's just a crisi di presenza, a crisis of being in the world. Okay, it's a very extreme interpretation of mental phenomena. I'm not justifying De Martino. I just want to show you how a cultural reflection has shaped the panorama of psychopathology in Italy. What is a being in the world crisis, a crisi di presenza? In De Martino's words, it's something that tries to make manifest a sort of unease that somebody has when he or she is not able to find his or her place in the world. And this fostered an approach to mental illness that for the very first time tried to put cultural elements in the definition of a mental health issue, okay? After De Martino, something else happened again, also engendered by this specific debate. And I am going to introduce you to figures, to individuals that have actually made the history of psychology in the European Union, and I'm talking about Franco Basaglia and his wife, best friend, and colleague, above all colleague, Franca Ongaro Basaglia. I sometimes when I tell about the Basaglias to my American students, the only comparison regarding the impact these people had on the development of a new way to think about the human mind is a comparison with Philip and Mamie Clark's. because their work actually shaped the policy of mental health in Italy. We're gonna take a look closer to the law that has been inspired and written by them. But it's important to understand that from a clinical and experimental experience, these two psychiatrists and psychotherapists reshaped completely the idea that we had of mental illness in my country. And if today we have a law, a national law, speaking about the rights of people with mental illness, is because of them, okay? So imagine this, both of them were educated in the best universities of Italy. I'm talking about the University of Rome, the University of Bologna, and the University of Venice, okay? And in all of these universities, they taught the same organicistic approach to mental illness. So when it was time for them to have their first opportunity to measure with actual mental illness, they were sent to the hospital, to the psychiatric asylum of Trieste, that is in the north of Italy, in the extreme northeast of Italy. They arrived at the hospital of Trieste in August 1971, and immediately Franco Basaglia had this very brilliant intuition to call all the youngest doctors, psychiatrists, and social workers, also students sometimes, in order to create a team able to redefine the concept of mental health and mental illness. They had a lot of bravery in doing so. Just imagine the fact that until the hegemony of, until the end of the hegemony of theoretical framework like the one of Ugo Cerletti, asylums were prisons, just prisons, okay? It was the real and actual goal of asylums to be places where undesired people were confined, okay? And what Basaglia did, he opened all the doors in the world, all the doors. No more cages, no more blocked doors, no more guards, armed guards with weapons, sometimes also guns. And he banished from they banished from their hospitals every form of shock therapy or physical restraints. This was something that was actually talked about as a revolution within the scientific and medical community, but above all, it was something to fear by the general population. Also because in order to try to make the patients citizens again, what the Basaglia did, they fostered and promoted visit from the asylum to the city in order to make the patients meet with people, with the so-called normal people. And this provoked a lot of scary reactions in the general population, okay? This was also there was also another intervention that the Basaglia made. They promoted the creation of living groups. What are living groups? Are apartments where a group of patients live, but outside the asylum, outside the hospital, just in the middle of the city, in order to look for a new job, or in order to make new friends, and avoid not only the actual confinement that those people lived in the asylums, but also it was also a way to gain their dignity again as human beings. Okay, Franco Basaglia was Franco and Franca Basaglia were revolutionaries in on every level, and during the 70s, other voices stood up in order to engender another change, a further change in the definition of mental illness and mental health. I am really glad to introduce to you an author that is known not so much, not even here in Italy, even if he had an important impact, because he can be considered as the man that stood against the hegemony of the Freudian approach. The name of this man was Massimo Fagioli. He died quite recently. And Fagioli was a psychiatrist, and he was convinced of the fact that Freudian theoretical framework had one major issue that was that he considered unacceptable to him. The fact that mental illness is like a human condition that you cannot escape. I don't know if you agree with these. Usually, as far as I know, American psychology has moved a lot from the Freudian position to new forms of, to new approaches to mental health. But think about the fact that in the 60s and the 70s, everything in Europe was dominated by the Freudian approach. I just want to share an anecdote with you. It's not about Italy, it's about France, but it's quite the same. Dyslexia, that is not a mental health issue, is a cognitive issue, is a cognitive disorder related to learning, is a learning disability, was considered a psychodynamic problem until the end of the 80s in France, because people, psychiatrists and psychotherapists belonging to the psychoanalytical approach of Sigmund Freud refused to recognize that there was another form of problem, that it was completely another issue. This was something very similar to what happened to autism, the autistic spectrum, when Bruno Bettelheim, another psychoanalyst, said that autism was caused by a bad relationship between the mother and her child. Okay, this is it is important to understand. I got a lot of friends of mine that are Freudian. Also, my former psychotherapist was a Freudian one, but this was a political problem. Psychoanalysts in Europe refused to acknowledge every new form of theory about psychopathology, about mental health issue, about mental illness. They say no, it's just something about what Freud said, okay? We don't want to discuss it anymore. And Massimo Fagioli fought this idea. He said, if we consider mental illness to be a part of the human condition, we are banishing the possibility that mental illness can be cured. It's not something it's something very important, because psychoanalysis, Freudian classical psychoanalysis, says that in the end, you can learn how to live with your own problems, but you cannot overcome them. Okay, Massimo Fagioli in 1976 entered a meeting of the Italian Psychoanalytical Society saying, I want to treat people in an efficient way, and I want to do this in order to make them gain mental health. He was expelled from the Italian Psychoanalytical Society. He was expelled, and for 20 years, nobody was allowed to go to his seminars. Okay, but since he also proposed a new alliance between psychiatry, psychopathology, and society in order to understand and reframe what mental illness has to be considered, he started to gain more and more momentum, especially among young people, and especially among people believing in a transformation, in a radical transformation of society. And he reached the climax of his public intervention about psychopathology when he created and introduced a new therapeutic method called the analisi collettiva, the collective analysis, that is a form of group therapy involving 50, 60 people for session. It's very, very radical. It's a very radical form. There is a lot of debate about the ability for this kind of therapeutic method to be efficient, but what I think here is that we have to remember Massimo Fagioli, because he has the bravery to say it's not, we don't have to follow a tenet or a dogma when speaking about mental illness and mental health. Mental health is something that changes with time, is something that changes in front of transformations within society. And so we have to take this into account if we want to propose an actual psychopathology that can work. We are moving to the end of the 70s, and we are about to see the most important action that the Basaglia did, but I want to spend one very little word about also this man, Giovanni Berlinguer. Giovanni Berlinguer was an Italian politician and an Italian physician. He was especially interested in the development of a humanistic way to psychopathology and psychiatry, but above all, he was the man that contributed the most to the creation of something that we are very proud of, the National Health Service, the National Health System of Italy. I don't know if you ever heard about it, but the National Health Service in Italy is considered one of the 3 most efficient health services in the world, and its model is still imitated in the world. Here in Italy, health system is free for everybody, citizens and not citizens, and there is a lot of emphasis on the concept of health as something that is both a fundamental right of the individual. Individual cannot be considered as somebody that has not the right to get medical treatment and medical care, and this is very important. As well as is an individual right, health is a general interest of the community. Okay, this is very, very important, because we are making a sort of sum of different clues, different advice, different pieces of theory that eventually will had led to a very revolution in psychology here in Italy. When Giovanni Berlinguer proposed the so-called Law 833, the so-called law about the National Health Service in Italy, the time was ready to accept another law proposal that was written and engendered by the discourse, the actions of Franco and Franca Basaglia. And I'm talking about the Law 180, that is also called the Basaglia Law. This man in the picture is Franco Basaglia, and behind him, you can see all the patients from the Trieste and Gorizia asylum smiling and being finally happy, because with the law 180, every asylum in Italy was closed. Before this law, there was an idea still lingering in Italian culture that patients with mental disorders were irrecoverable, socially dangerous, they had to be removed from society or marginalized in their own family, especially, but just only in the case when they were rich patients. Otherwise, there were just prisons for them. With the Law 180, the Basaglia Law, asylums were closed for good, and the idea was to give back to psychiatric patients and people with mental illness also outside the asylums dignity and value to their life. Okay, this was the beginning of a revolution. Today, still today, we think in Italy that Basaglia was the man that just make this country move away from a tradition of horrific actions against, not for, against people with mental illness. And if nowadays we think of mental health issues as something that can be handled first and foremost by the community, is because of him. Of course, there are pros and cons in this discourse, but we are gonna face them in a while. I just want to summarize what was the legacy of the anti-psychiatry movement, how the work by Basaglia shaped the perception of mental illness. Well, we can summarize this in two sentences. The first one is about the nature of mental illness. In Italy, there is a widespread opinion that mental disorders are only partially biologically based, and that environment and personality are very, very more important in defining mental health issues or in defining an abnormal situation related to psychology and the human mind. The second sentence is about the treatment and the care to be reserved to mental illness, because according to Basaglia and the legacy of the Basaglian movement, mental health is something that should be handled at first by the community. No, it doesn't matter if it's a community of family, friends, or colleagues, rather than by physicians and psychiatrists. There is a very peculiar, also weird sometimes, status about psychologists and psychotherapists, because you know, what is the real power of psychotherapists? They are in the middle between humanities and science and biomedical science. They can move. They are just like, as we say in Italy, they're like frog. They can go outside the water and inside the water, and this is their strengths. Okay. But here in Italy, this translates also in the fact that psychotherapists are always considered not so scientific by the physicians, and they are considered too much scientific from the perspective of social workers. But I think that that's the best position that somebody taking care of somebody else can have, because they can move, psychologists can move freely from one side to the other, and being the actual bridge between these two positions. In the end, today all the Western civilization is focused on the so-called bio-psychosocial model of mental health and mental illness, and I guess that colleagues and friends like Professor Sims are exactly in the middle and in the best positions to handle complex situations like mental health. Remember that facing complex questions, you can never give a simple answer to a complex question, and psychology is probably the more complex, in the good way, discipline about the human being that is possible to be thought. I really love psychology. I devoted all my life studying this discipline because I think it's amazing and very powerful. However, just one little digression, because I have not the possibility to bring you today there. I hope to be able to do this this summer. The legacy of the anti-psychiatrist movement and the Basaglia movement is in a way embodied in the Museo Laboratorio della Mente, the Museum Laboratory of Mind. Professor Sims and I visited this during this summer. It is what we call a narrative museum. its main goal is to document the history of the institution of the asylums and to make you elaborate a reflection about what mental health and mental disorder are, but also connecting these issues to the politics of care and culture and the involvement of community in defining what mental health is. I think that it's important to highlight that the museum is a place where the pavilion number 6 of the former asylum of Rome was, and around the pavilion there are still today parts of the former asylum that have been transformed in mental health services after the Basaglia law. But if we will have the opportunity to visit the museum together, you will see that it's a very touching experience, because it's like you are about to be brought in the middle of an actual asylum. There are original rooms, there are interactive rooms devoted to make you feel the experience of suffering from mental health and mental diseases. And I think that this has a very important education value, okay, in order to become a practiced and skilled psychologist and psychotherapist. However, apart from these, let's move to the last part of my lesson. I already talked for an hour, but I tried to stay in 10 minutes. Sorry for being so, European. The focus is about depression and schizophrenia, the way we interpret them in Italy. And I am referring to a set of scientific papers that I have selected and that I will be glad to share with you with Professor Sins. So let's move to depression, okay? This study from 2013, I think this is a very important study. It had a lot of, there was a lot of debate about it, because for the very first time, somebody tried to measure the public beliefs and the attitudes toward the depression in Italy. It was a national survey. And as you can see from this table, 4 definitions of depression were proposed to the sample, and it was labeled at first as a state of excessive anxiety. The second, the definition was depression is a weakness of character. The third one was depression is a commonplace illness, and the fourth one was depression is a mental illness. The vast majority of the sample and this reflects perfectly what we think, what the lay people think here in Italy. The widespread opinion is that depression is a commonplace illness, is not a mental illness. It's something that everybody can experience at some point of his or her life, and is not necessarily something that you have to treat with drugs or to treat with psychotherapy sometimes. And what you can see here, it's quite clear that there is an influence of what was the legacy of the Basaglia movement. Okay, there was this idea that we don't have to hospitalize or to medical treat, also in a brutal way, people because they are depressed. Okay, and this is reflected, for example, in a very important difference between the use of antidepressant drugs in the United States and in Italy. In the United States, in 2013, 1 in 6 adults took up psychiatric drugs. In 2015, 1 in 10 Italian adults reported to do the same. Okay, what does it mean? What this data tells us? Well, we try to avoid using antidepressant drugs even if there is a depression diagnosis from our general practitioner, from a specialist, because there is a sort of rejection of all the medical treatment. Just remember one thing that I am put in the lines before, but it's something that I want to elucidate better. In Italy, there is still a practice that sometimes is applied that is called the trattamento sanitario obbligatorio, mandatory medical treatment. What is a mandatory medical treatment? When the police says that you are not a normal person, they are able to request a forced medical intervention on you, putting you into a medical prison where you are treated exclusively with drugs. Okay, exclusively with drugs like lithium or other form of psychoactive drugs in order to make you calm. This is something that is denounced continuously by civil rights movement here in Italy. But it's another, is the other side of the coin in saying explaining why there is a sort of suspicion, a suspect against the medical treatment based on antidepressant drugs. However, I also have to be honest and scientifically honest and say something. This approach to depression can also lead to severe backlashes, because depression, you know, we saw it from the facts and figures section of this lecture. Depression is widespread. It is the most widespread mental disorder in Italy. And if there is a solid and widespread belief that depression is not a pathology, we have the risk to not being able to see people suffering from severe depression and being able to treat them rightly. This is something that is reflected also on the consequences on the stigma related to depression. For example, 1/3 of the total respondents of the study by Munizza, of the research by Munizza, expressed a lot of prejudices toward depressed people. For example, they say that depression was a dangerous illness that, please note this, could be overcome with willpower. And you know very well that this is something that is like the first thing that you don't have to do when talking about when talking with people with depression. You don't have to say, oh, come on, just hang out with your friends and it's gonna pass. It's not. This is not the truth. Depression is a pathology, can be a severe pathology, also leading to suicidal tendencies. Okay, and having the idea that this is something that you can overcome with willpower can be even more stigmatizing, okay? Another widespread belief is 3/4 of the sample, is that people suffering from depression should avoid talking about their problem. That means that according to a vast majority of Italian people, depression should be experienced in solitude. I don't want to repeat what Professor Sims surely have said and explained in a brilliant way to you, but depression is not something that you have to handle with solitude. It's exactly the same. You have to find a network of people sustaining you in your recovery. Okay. Now I know that you haven't talked about schizophrenia yet, but I also want to introduce to you the debate about the beliefs on schizophrenia in my country. This is, I will be very quick about this. I just want you to take a look at the underlined sentences here. Of those surveyed, the 34% of the lay respondents, the 20% of the professionals, and the 68% of the patient's relative stated that schizophrenia is exclusively caused by psychosocial factors. This is exactly the legacy of the Basaglia movement. People in the asylums who were were mostly people suffering from schizophrenia, the people that were actually ill, but the legacy of the closure of the asylums had also these, not very good part of not very good reflection. It's not it's neither consistent with scientific findings nor useful in order to treat schizophrenia, that is a very complex disorder. In Italy, there is this idea, even among professionals, this is very important, that schizophrenia is completely and purely a psychosocial issue, not a biological one. And today we know that we cannot separate the two approaches in order to have a consistent view of the disorder and the people suffering from this disorder. Finally, I want to move toward this study that I will be very glad if you want to take to spend 5 minutes reading it, because I think it is very, very a very good study dealing with the community attitudes towards mental illness and the demographic characteristics of people expressing specific beliefs. This study shows a lot of things about the conceptualization of psychiatric stigma here in Italy. And the Buitz and his colleagues revealed 3 different attitudes toward mental illness in my country. The first one is an attitude based on physical distance and fear from people, for people suffering from mental illness. The second one was social isolation, and the third one was actually the best one, social responsibility and tolerance. What is quite interesting to notice is the fact that factor 1 is associated with old people or people having experienced the sort of grief of some form, some way. And above all, people who haven't an experience of social or medical activities, people that don't do volunteering, that usually don't take care of other people in their community. Social isolation, that is the most widespread, is associated with people older than in their 40s or older. People being schooled at a level higher than the elementary level, but usually not graduated people, and unemployed people. This is something that if you will take, or if you have taken a social psychology class, you can easily put these in relationship with the nature of prejudice and the birth of prejudices in our society. Factor 3, on the other hand, doesn't present any associations, but I wrote to Buitz in order to look for new developments of this kind of studies, and I heard that they are trying to elucidate if there is a correlation between specific school level, specific educational level. However, I think that it's quite important that at the state of the art, there are no associations between an attitude toward the social responsibility and the demographic factors, because this means also that, there is a homogeneous spread of the idea that we have to be responsible and to tolerate people with mental illness by including them in the society. This is spread on a general level through the population. So I have almost finished my presentation. I just wanted to make you understand why I have bored you to death for more than an hour by talking about the history of psychology, history of psychiatry in Italy, and talking about what the stigma, the psychiatric stigma is relating to depression or to schizophrenia in my country. Well, this was the same thing that I told Alex when I met her, and when we spent a lot of hours talking about this. I think, as I said before, that the Western world still has something to say in order to make this world a better place. We have to do a lot of criticism about what we did in the past, and my lecture today maybe is one of the best example. I thought about a lot of horrific things that we made in the past in this country, but what is at stake is the future of psychology and psychotherapy and psychopathology. I'm talking about problems, for example, that we are facing in front of the migrations in Europe. You probably know that we faced a lot of migration wave in the Mediterranean Sea, and this has polarized the political debate. I think that facing the horror of war or climate change, we just have to welcome these people. But welcoming people and adopting a monolithical and, hegemonic, authoritarian approach toward mental illness can be a fake welcome, can be something not so useful, not so efficient. We started publishing a lot of studies in recent years about the relationship between migration and mental health in Europe. And all these studies concluded that we have one tool in order to face the new forms of mental illness or mental health issues at large that people from other cultures could present. And this tool is intercultural and international dialogue, the adoption of new perspectives of several different perspectives about mental health. And I know I think that I made a revolution with this lecture, but I hope that I have put a little brick in the construction of this new theoretical building that will start, I think, exclusively if you start to talk again and to put our perspectives on comparison, trying to make a new synthesis in order to create a new psychopathology and a new psychotherapy for the future. And I'm quite sure that you have one of the best teachers that you can have, my friend Professor Sins. So I want to thank you for your attention. I hope to see you in Rome, and I hope to be your guide through the scientific museums that I mentioned before. So thank you so much. Hoping that I wasn't so boring as I'm quite sure that I was. And feel free to write me for any further information or debate. And thank you so much.
Yay, thank you so much. That really was a wonderful talk. Our class actually ended 4 minutes ago, and this is how you can tell how wonderful your talk was, because you had about a third of the people stick around past class. So congrats to you. And thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to linger around for a little while to talk to you. And I think we still have a few people here. If anyone wants to ask a question or needs more encouragement to join us on a trip this summer and come to the Museum of the Mind in Rome, we can try and convince you. Otherwise, my class, thanks for sticking around. Email me any questions that you have or use the discussion board in Canvas, but we will continue to wait for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
And of course, I'm going to send to Professor Sims both the PDF presentation of this lecture and the papers associated that I mentioned within the lecture. So if you want to take a read or make your own idea about intercultural approaches to psychopathology, I will also be glad to read from you if you want to write me or through Professor Sims and their work that I really appreciate.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sending those papers along. I'll probably actually end up assigning the schizophrenia one for that unit, but we don't have until December. So our academic calendar's been moved up quite a bit. So I will make that an official assignment. So thank you. Those rates are pretty bananas to me, how high they are. And also just the discussion of schizophrenia in general is really interesting. So thank you.
No. No, thank you, and thanks CIEE for this opportunity. Thank Annie Gibson and Emma for the introduction and for arranging this meeting. I hope that we have other occasions, other opportunities, and if you haven't any question, I leave you to your work. It's almost night here in Italy, but yeah, I think that you have a long day to go. Also,